Welcome, Dr. James Beckett, Sports Card Insights, another listener question episode, 11 of them. I think I can fit them in my 15 minutes. Thanks sponsors, Topps, Panini, Upper Deck, Heritage Auctions, Huggins Scott Auctions, Mike Stadium Sports Cards, Burbank Sports Cards, ComC.com, and Beckett Media, Beckett Grading, Beckett Authentication. First question about my hanger and blaster experience. And I think people like that. It probably was more expensive than I wanted it to be because I won 3 lots instead of 1. And Mookie in particular said he was identifying with the cascading, successive closing of lots where naturally the one I wanted the most closed last. And I wound up having FOMO to not get shut out. So he says he's been there and he appreciates the experiential journalism. I have a lot of experience and most of it is last century, but doing some things currently is fun as well. The hobby has changed in some respects. There's still the delight of opening. And the other comment about that was when you have all these different product configurations, I started out thinking I was going to analyze to see which version of the product yields the most. That's really maybe not even the right question because they yield according to what you pay for on average. The higher the price, the better stuff you get. But the main thing pushing back is that you're not just as likely, but you're influenced by when you get a bigger card, even a $100 card, because that's about the best I got. I could have gotten that out of a hanger pack, could have gotten out of a blaster. Much more likely to get it out of blaster because there's just better stuff in there. Number 2, John Keating, who's gotten airtime lately, he mentioned in commenting about Rich's episode I did about selling out, because this last time Rich sold to a guy named John, and John Keating, JK, the Just Kidder, said Rich sold to the wrong John. And I noticed, John Keating, you've been a bigger buyer lately, talking about your basement enterprise, and I've got a backhouse enterprise. I'm looking forward to comparing notes on that. Number 3 from TJ is online, talking about the 1954 Bowman Ted Williams. He's done a little bit of research, and thank you, Tony, for doing this, is that the 54 Bowman, originally back in the day, it really was, he says it was second only to the 52 Topps Mantle. That's not far off. It was a very tough card. It was one of the last cards I got. From my experience, yes, it's way tougher. In fact, I maybe got a 52 Topps Mantle before I got a 54 Bowman Ted Williams. Now, what, Tony, you're talking about is there was a little bit of a find, probably beginning of the year packs. So if you had some boxes, if you were a kid that bought early in 1954, there would be a bunch of Williams and none of the Pearsalls. But the Pearsalls really took over for more available at this point in time. I will say this, when I was completing sets and trying to do master sets, something about completing a set of 54 Bowman and pretending like it's complete with number 66 being Jim Pearsall. There would be 2 Jim Pearsalls, but that was considered the base set, the more common variation. And Tony, you did some universal grading pop report metrics. You're talk about taking with a grain of salt, but I think they're not far off. He says he's got 2,054 Bowman Ted Williams as opposed to 8,054 Bowman Mantles. Again, definitely a short print, and that's obvious, but only 2,852 Topps Mantles. So the 54 Williams being tougher than that. Williams was a big deal in the 50s, and he didn't have as many cards. He was going back and forth, not having cards or being with one company or the other. And Fleer as well. Only 1,352 Topps Matthews, last card in the set. Only 1,166 52 Topps Campanella, also high number, as opposed to 2,649, 48, 49 Leaf Jackie Robinsons, which is not a short print, but those have come out of the woodwork to be just massively graded. It's a card where you really need to grade it. And then he has 2,600, a similar number of 49 Bowman Robinsons. It's possible. The Leaf non-short prints, the 49 easier cards, which are still not easy, of the 49 Leafs, those are probably not that much tougher than the low numbers of the 49 Bowman, in my experience. Well, what you've done, Tony, is point out the intuitive scarcity that I saw empirically based on my own experience has been borne out by pop reports. With pop reports are not conclusive and they just report what has happened, but the 54 Williams, great card. And perhaps the second best card in the 50s. At least it was when I was there. It's got a nice note from Robin Pauls, the post-serial expert. We did an episode or 2 together, and he talked about his graded set of post-serial football cards. And the problem of the cards came on the back of the box. There was an adhesive on the box, which would then be the backs of the cards, a little smear of adhesive so that the liner bag that held the cereal inside the box would not float around. But that meant stains on the backs of many of the cards. And so Robin's point is, you get crushed when you grade them. I've had cards graded that are post-serial. And yes, there's a bunch of them, not all of them, but a bunch of them will have that intrusive stain. But he says, what about removing the stain with an undetectable solvent? The problem is, if it's a solvent that's good enough to get that glue off, it may or may not be undetectable. It may be initially undetectable, but is it permanently undetectable? The jury's out on that. If you go a number of years, it may be that solvent that looked like it was undetectable became detectable. Sometimes they're detectable by smell. When the humidity changes, it may discolor. I've always thought that PSA should give a BD qualifier. If a card is an 8 on the front and it's got the glue stain on the back, it's going to get crushed, but it could still be an 8 with a BD qualifier for back damage. That would take down the value. But if I'm collecting post-serials, which I had complete sets of all those, you just can't help it. It's the way they came out. On the other hand, the dilemma of the grading companies is the glue stains are not always in the same place. And there are cards without glue stains. There has to be a way to do that. But I covered that a few years ago when I did my episode on grading, which was front and center grading. In front and center grading, you don't care about the back. You just care about the front. And you really just care if it's centered. And I was just thinking, how is that different from eye appeal? Eye appeal, you don't really care about the surface with eye appeal as long as it's not out of phase, out of focus. You don't really care about the edges unless they're jagged. You don't really care about the corners if there's minor wear that you can barely see. You're mainly looking your first impression. You're not looking at the back of the card either. The front and center grading is another way of thinking of eye appeal. It's a nicely centered card, not much wear, and that's a great card for my collection. In fact, a lot of my cards are eye appeal. There wasn't grading when I was buying those. Number 5 from Tim Halimi. He talked about the 1930s Sporting News stamps. I believe those were inside the Sporting News. And if they were, then they're a newsprint card, and that makes them quasi-legitimate. I think they're still interesting. They're card-like elements. The Sporting News was saved, so if people have those particular issues, I think they came out weekly back in the 30s, but they were saved. They yellow, they weather. Back in about 1972, I may have talked about this. I got a VIP tour of the Sporting News in St. Louis there, and I got to go through the archives. It's amazing. Type 1 photo. They were by player. One of my fraternity's brothers, his mom was the Spink secretary and got me in there, and I had a great time. Spent a half a day there. It was very much fun. Maybe 73. And then from Ziggy, my Panini Prism football perspectives, he said, great video and awesome to rip Prism. Now, Ziggy, do you mean rip them in sense of disrespect or rip them open? And then he talks about the CT scanners, that the hobby will evolve. I agree. I think Ziggy points out things, and then he's trying to point out that a solution will come. And I think that's the right way to see it. It's not the end of the world, but it's going to mean the card company is going to have to adopt some countermeasures. And I hope they do, and I know they will. Again, I enjoyed ripping in the positive sense any product, really, even if it comes out not so great. Game Time Gallery, talking about Velveeta boxes. They were the original storage box. I agree. I did have some of those, but I never liked Velveeta that much. I liked it a little bit, but I grew out of that phase when I graduated from college. And then he remembers the article on the PVC, the plastic sheets thing, which I'm trying to put a positive tone on things, but I'm trying to create some history in the hobby of things that happened, my perspective on it. And that was something I prefer to forget, but it's worth telling the story. But he said he then took his cards out of the plastic sheets and put them in screw downs. Don't put them in screw downs and screw them all the way. It's like putting the top back on the jar. If you put it on too tight, you can't get it back off. So don't do that. From Sports Card Professor, talking about Pacific, saying he says he thought Pacific always was a major card company. I think they had greater esteem in football. It's baseball. That was where the action was in those years. That was the main thing. And Pacific may have been lowercase major, but not full capital M major. It's like the Power 4 conferences or the Power 5 conferences. You could be Division I sports, but if you're in a mid-major, you don't get the same respect. They had done the Spanish baseball, and that was requiring them, I believe, to prove they could do it, which they could. They had great competency in terms of understanding the hobby. He said basically he thought that Pacific had a similar footprint to Donruss in the 90s. I think maybe peaked in 1984. They became a major in 1984 with Don Mattingly, and by the 90s, especially the late 90s, Donruss was not that much different from Pacific, perhaps. Then from Alan Mazur, talking about the modern metrics with wins above replacement, all these different things, and these great players from the past, are they going to be getting additional appreciation because they measure so well in new metrics? I think they will a little bit. He mentions Lefty Grove, Joe Morgan, Mel Ott, all great players, great in many ways, and probably undervalued at their time, not by their managers, but the sabermetricians can see that they were more extraordinary. But the problem, Alan, is that in those days, in the 30s and the 40s and even the 50s, the owners controlled the salary, the managers controlled the playing time, and these players, even if they were slugger, they were instructed by their managers of how to play, what to do, whether to bunt, whether to hit behind the runner. Nowadays, it's a lot more every person for himself in terms of when you're up at bat. But in those days, they didn't want you to swing for the fences, or they would say, yeah, swing for the fences. So it wasn't trying to get extra base hits necessarily if going with the pitch and stuff like that. So they did what they were asked to do, and they weren't asked to walk. They were asked to get a hit. Batting average was a bigger deal than slugging percentage. Home runs was a big deal, those kind of counting statistics. But the final point is that if demand increases for Lefty Grove, who truly with scrutiny was a great player, and Mel Ott, same thing, increased demand eventually leads to higher prices. And so if you start accumulating them, that could happen. The other thing is, in the old timers, they indicate who the players thought were the really good players. Next to last here, cards or money. This has come up. If you've got money and you got cards, which one would you rather have? If you got $100 and there's a $100 card on a showcase, would you rather have $100 or rather have 100 cards? The problem is that for some people, $100 is not a big deal. For some people, it is. If it's $1,000, if it's $1 million, if you pull a card from a break and it's $1 million or $100,000, that's life-changing money for people. And it's almost like it becomes beyond a hobby. For the good of your family, you need to sell the card. So that could be if you just got it or you got it up. How you define yourself as a collector, it doesn't make you less of a collector if you have a threshold. I've never heard this talked about, but if you have a maximum value of a card in your collection, it just wouldn't make sense to have a card more than $100,000 for some people. You would have to sell it. And so that doesn't mean you're a terrible collector. It just means there are constraints based on your personal financial situation. So enjoy. Now, I'm hunting in the dollar box. It's not because I can't afford other stuff. It's because I'm enjoying that. I don't have to move money around or think about anything. I can just enjoy the cards. And then lastly, from Mookie, frequent contributor, talking about my experience helping my good friend and his niece and nephew when they needed to sell their deceased dad's collection, who was his brother-in-law. Mookie, I think that might be the last time I did a good turn. It just made me appreciate. I've got a couple auction sponsors. A good quality auction house can do what I did. I think I got more money than they would have, but I also had a lot of free labor, which I enjoyed. But it's pretty hard to beat an auction house if they're trusted, high integrity. They come in, and my dilemma there, and the reason I have two, is I think that every auction house has a specialty, and some of them are really good at certain things, and other things they don't give as much attention to. That's why I think Huggins and Scott has a different portion of the market than Heritage does, and there are others as well. So I want to do a good job on everything, recognizing and understanding that you're going to get 80% of the money from 20% of the cards. So Mookie, I learned that lesson. I am back retired from helping friends unless something just is so overwhelming that I've learned what not to do when my time comes. I hope you're prepared, as well as my other many listeners and viewers. So have a great time. I will talk to you soon, and enjoy the hobby.